The Bible has like bookends. If you're reading Old and New, you're going to see that, for example, when God made the tree of life, he also says towards the end of the book in Revelation that that tree will appear and consumption of the leaves of that tree will be for the healing of nations, which I believe he doesn't say the fruit thereof, he simply says the leaves, a little bit different, but there are bookends, all right? Where death basically ruled the earth after the fall, there shall be no more dying. All of these bookends, including, if you look carefully, some of these plagues are pictures or vignettes into the future, and there's some very pivotal things that you can mine out of these chapters. Early on in Exodus, we read that there rose up a Pharaoh after Joseph dies. Remember, he was very powerful. He saved the Egyptians and he saved his kindred. But it says there rose up a Pharaoh who knew not Joseph. I want you to take a look at this passage. Sometimes it's passages we're familiar with, but if you actually look at them, and especially for people who are not that well versed, you're looking at the first chapter of Exodus and from verse 8 onward, where it says, "Now there arose up a new king over Egypt, which knew not Joseph." Now, let me pause right there and simply say that most people, even myself, I grapple with this. If Joseph saved Egypt, which he did, I find it very hard to believe that a Pharaoh could rise to power without knowing that this man, you know, we memorialize people. That's our nature, right? So the only thing that could make sense to me is that this Pharaoh would have to possibly be a child coming up and not having lived long enough to know. So let's just put that there. That's what I have always believed, that this had to be a young child king, all right? But we basically read that now with this new king, this new Pharaoh, it says, "And he said unto his people, Behold, the people of the children of Israel are more and mightier than we. Come on, let us deal wisely with them, lest they multiply. And it come to pass that when there falleth out any war, they join also unto our enemies and fight against us, and so get them up and out of the land. Therefore they did set over them taskmasters to afflict them with their burdens, and they built for Pharaoh treasure cities, Pithom and Ramses. But the more they afflicted them, the more they multiplied and grew. And they were grieved because of the children of Israel." Now, let me stop right there. And I'm going to say something which will probably be elaborated 2 or 3 messages down the road. But I know I am so not popular when I say these things. But if you are anywhere near my age, somewhere around my age, you probably watched Cecil B. DeMille's 10 Commandments, right? Where most people think that that's the real story. And listen, there are a lot of people who watch movies and then they think that's history. It's Hollywood, folks. Wake up. So let's just do something really quick. I'm going to take 2 minutes to do this, and I know I always, in these 2 minutes, manage to piss more people off, but hey, that's what I'm good at. So let's just make one thing clear. You're going to read this. I'm going to teach a whole lesson on this, but you're going to read in this what you don't read so much in Genesis. You're going to read in the opening chapters of Exodus a lot of references to Hebrews, Hebrew midwives, Hebrew children, on and on and on and on. And this is what I promised you. I'm going to deliver a message on this, and then hopefully I can have a little bit more peace, although I don't think I'm ever going to have peace. I feel tormented by people who do not listen and who do not understand that Hebrew people being referred to in the book of Exodus do not and are not analogous to and do not equate to Jews or Judaism. All right? You can say all the people that are referred to as Hebrews in this instance must be understood as descendants of Eber, and that simply is translated, that's way back there in Genesis 10 in the Table of Nations, are either descendants of Eber, and that by virtue means people who crossed over from the other side, meaning the Euphrates, okay? So that's a nomenclature for these people who did indeed, if you look back 2 or 3 generations beyond their several hundred years being in Egypt, did cross over from the Euphrates. So therefore, Hebrew, just think of it as the word it occurs in the Table of Nations, E-B-E-R. That's one designation of a name, and it designates these people which cannot be equated to Judaism, which, by the way, did not exist at this time. And I'm actually going to say this so we can have a little bit more clarity. I did this before in the Table of Nations, so all descendants from the son of Noah, whose name is Shem, become known as Semites. Eber is in that descending line from Shem, or in that lineage. So Semites, which includes both people who are being named as Hebrews, which also incorporates folks who are Arabs, eventually known as Arab people. So it's very frustrating when people read this and immediately think they go with Cecil B. DeMille, and somehow the people who are afflicted here are automatically Jewish. Just FYI, we know that Moses is going to be called a Hebrew child, and he was not even from the tribe of Judah. His parents came from the tribe of Levi, which would have been the priestly tribe, which had not yet been developed into that because Moses had not yet left Egypt and was still considered a prince in Egypt. All right, we'll come back to that one at some point, I'm sure, believe me. All right, so just a little sidebar there. People start to, they hear Hebrew and all of a sudden they go, oh, these people, and no. So once we understand that and we're clear, let's ask this question. They were in bondage. We have beginning in the 2nd chapter of Exodus, we have the story of, it opens with this: there was a man of the house of Levi and took to wife a daughter of Levi. That's Levi twice over, right? Levi and Levi makes Levi. Or it makes genes, I don't know. And the woman conceived and bare a son. This is Moses. This is Moses. And Moses has a brother, Aaron, and a sister, Miriam. All right? But at this point, you will not read anywhere in this book, the only reference you're going to read is the fact that they are Hebrews from the tribe of Levi. All right? That's it. Please. All right. Okay, now let's go back to looking at Exodus 1 from verse 14 onwards. It says, "And they made their lives bitter with hard bondage in mortar and in brick and in all manner of service in the field. All their service wherein they made them serve was with rigor. And the king of Egypt spake to the Hebrew midwives, of which the name of one was Shiphrah and the other one was Puah. And he said, why, when you do the office of a midwife to the Hebrew women, and see them upon the stools, if it be a son, then ye shall kill him. But if it be a daughter, then she shall live." Now, most people automatically who do not know the Bible immediately jump to something they've heard of before: God smiting all the firstborn just before the children of Israel are delivered out of Egypt's bondage. You never hear anybody saying, what type of Pharaoh, what type of king would sentence children to die? You never hear that. You only hear about, it's always this way. Why would God do that? Well, here's Pharaoh saying basically, kill the male children that are born. Just saying, if you're going to read this, read it with both eyes and the full brain, all right? It's very insulting to me when I hear people say, well, God did this and God did that. But yeah, did you look at what maybe brought God to do what he did is the sinful, immoral behavior of those that were in the world at the time? So this goes right back to, you could talk about the flood, the same thing. God said he saw the evil that was in man. So God's solution was, I'm going to wipe out the earth. I'm going to wash it clean. So again, just kind of balance here and know sometimes that God had good reason for doing what he did. So we have this child somehow that, I like to call him a basket child, that survives because he is hidden in a basket, put in the Nile. We know that Pharaoh's daughter draws him out of the water. He is raised in the palace in Egypt as an Egyptian child. He's raised that way. He's educated in the ways of Egypt and in every dimension, which I should put clearly here, that Egypt was filled with different gods. If you're familiar a little bit with anything of the history of Egypt, there were gods for everything, all right? So it would be safe to say that Moses was most likely raised and educated with all of that wisdom, but also all of the wisdom of worshiping and bowing down to the gods of Egypt. And people never talk about this. They automatically assume that this was a good child and knew God's ways immediately, even while he was being raised by Pharaoh's daughter. I'm gonna keep hammering on this to show you how even some of us who are really studying this can make the mistake. So we have Moses, who basically grows up and he rises to great prominence in Egypt. And if we start reading in chapter 2 and verse 11, and it says, "When it came to pass in those days when Moses was grown, that he went out unto his brethren and looked on their burdens, and he spied an Egyptian smiting a Hebrew, one of his brethren. And when he looked this way and that way, and when he saw that there was no man, he slew the Egyptian, hid him in the sand. And when he went out the second day, behold, 2 men of the Hebrews strove together." You see how many references to Hebrews there are in this passage, just in the first opening chapters of Exodus. And so they asked him, "Wherefore smitest thou thy fellow?" And he said, "Who madest thee a prince and a judge over us? Intendest thou to kill me as thou killed the Egyptian?" And Moses feared and said, "Surely this thing is known." And when Pharaoh heard this thing, he sought to slay Moses, but Moses fled from the face of Pharaoh and dwelt in the land of Midian. And now begins a completely different chapter of Moses' life. So here's the thing. If you read on in 2:23, it says, "And it came to pass in the process of time that the king of Egypt died." So we have 2 pharaohs who died, one that knew not Joseph, and this one who Moses was well acquainted with, all right? So you've got that kind of timeline to kind of look at this. Now, in verse 24, read this very carefully. "And God heard the groaning, and God remembered his covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob." Let me stop right here to say that it's very interesting. God didn't hear the people in bondage calling out to him. They just heard their groanings. That's a very important thing. Now, I'm not going to answer the question today, but trust me, in about 2 or 3 weeks, I will. Just something for you to reflect on. What do you think the children of Israel, therefore in Egypt since the time of Jacob, but now in bondage, what do you think they practiced as a religion? Don't answer, just think about it. Because there is an answer in the Bible. It does tell us actually what they did in Egypt. And it's maybe not what you think at all. But it would shut the mouths of people who want to say they were practicing Judaism. All right, I know, thank you for laughing. That tells me you get it. All right. Well, I will address this though, believe me, because it's the topic that everybody can't seem to get right. All right, by the 4th chapter, we have exchanges going on back and forth between God and Moses, where God now has given Moses power and basically given him charge to go and basically be the mouthpiece as the deliverer to get those children of Israel out of the bondage that they are in. And of course, you know the passage where Moses says, "Well, I can't speak," and basically makes a deal with God to say, "Okay, you can take with your brother Aaron. He can speak for you. He can be your mouthpiece." And so we have Moses and Aaron returning to Egypt, and there are many exchanges back and forth. Petitions are pleas to let the children of Israel go. Now, once you get to, and I'm just going through this quickly because I want to be able to preach my message. I know I'm going to run out of time. So once you get to the 7th chapter of Exodus, you can start kind of to see, we finally get to we'll call it the chapter where we start seeing the plagues appear. Now, I know I can't win every person over, but there are enough people that I've heard say this doesn't make sense to me at all. Why would a good God, if God created everything, if the earth is his, if blah, 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 why would he do this? And they fail to see that nestled within the book of Exodus are several things, that one of them is a prototype that we'll see in the book of Revelation. Remember, I told you the Bible has like bookends. If you're reading Old and New, you're going to see that, for example, when God made the tree of life, he also says towards the end of the book in Revelation that that tree will appear and consumption of the leaves of that tree will be for the healing of nations, which I believe he doesn't say the fruit thereof, he simply says the leaves, a little bit different, but there are bookends, all right, where death basically ruled the earth after the fall. There shall be no more dying. All of these bookends, including, if you look carefully, some of these plagues are pictures or vignettes into the future, and there's some very pivotal things that you can mine out of these chapters. So we're going to look at the plagues, then their purpose. Let's just say initially they were to provide a public display of God's powers so that even the Egyptian magicians and sorcerers would have to acknowledge that this was something way beyond just a magic trick. They uttered out of their mouth, "This is the finger of God." They didn't say of the gods, they said of God. Pretty radical when you think that if you, in your own time, read the exchange, they just basically reduced the rod that God had given as just another, like theirs, just another piece of wood that they could do a trick with. So a lot of this is to put God's power on display. We'll call it a picture of God's dispensing wrath that should have induced recognition of who God is and what he was doing. Now, when Pharaoh called for Moses and Aaron in haste, there's something very interesting. Just if you can let me read it to you, but take notes somewhere. You're going to read in Exodus 10:16, Pharaoh called for Moses and Aaron in haste, and he said, "I have sinned against the Lord your God and against you." And it's a big statement. Why? Because it tells us if somebody can utter that statement, only two things are going to happen. I have sinned against the Lord, he says, your God, and against you. Either in a real act of contrition, God who sees the heart could have done differently, but it says in another passage that God was hardening Pharaoh's heart, building up the wrath that would be poured out so that he could not say, I've sinned against your God or my God, claiming for himself. So that statement it really gives you an indicator that God was determined to just pile it up. He wasn't going to let any form of backing out become a milder or lesser punishment. And you remember back in Genesis, the Lord says to Abraham that he will keep pouring this type of stuff out until the satisfaction of what needs to happen, he says, to the Amorites is fulfilled. But I think that's kind of code for saying, I have my time, I have my ways, I'll do what I say I'm going to do, possibly in the future, and this is the unfolding of it. So the other thing is that these plagues would put God in a place above all the other gods that were worshipped in Egypt, that which was stated by Jethro. You remember who Jethro is? Okay, if you don't, go find him. I'm not going to tell you. It'd be like where's Waldo? All right. Blessed be the Lord who hath delivered you out of the hand of Egypt and out of the hand of Pharaoh, who hath delivered the people from under the hand of the Egyptians. He had recognition that God did this. He says, now I know that the Lord is greater than all gods, for in the thing wherein they dealt proudly, he was above them. That's a huge statement right there. I think there was the design for that, but take a look at something else. I'm going to read this to you so you're not flipping through chapters and then trying to get back to where we are. So don't turn, please. Don't turn there because it'll take you too long. And by the time I'm done reading and you get there, I will be gone. All right. It's just always the way it is. So in another book, Rahab says, she says unto the men, I know that the Lord hath given you the land, and that your terror is fallen upon us, and that all the inhabitants of the land faint because of you. And we have heard how the Lord dried up the water of the Red Sea for you when you came out of Egypt, and what ye did unto the 2 kings of the Amorites that were on the other side of Jordan, Sihon and Og, whom ye utterly destroyed. So this now would be perpetuated of this great deliverance, if you will. But it had a purpose, and that purpose is uttered by Rahab. Essentially, I know that the Lord, basically, I know the Lord is God. He's able to deliver. He's able. He's got the power. That's basically in a nutshell. There's also another utterance similar to this by the Philistines in 1 Samuel 4:8, if you want to read it in your own time. As for the number of plagues, 10, the number of what? Okay, some but not all. Human responsibility. So the 10th plague being really separate from the other 9 because of its implications on the people, all right? So 9 plagues, I'm not going to talk about the 10th right now. 9 plagues are arranged in groups of 3. A warning is given for the 1st and 2nd plagues, but the 3rd in each group, no warning is given. Very interesting. Moses is told to meet Pharaoh before the waters turn to blood, and again, we'll read that the frogs will cover the land. But when God unleashed the plague of lice, there was no warning given to the people, all right? So there's a pattern. If you look at 9, not 10, but 9 plagues, there are in groups of 3s. The first 3 plagues, Aaron uses the rod. In the 2nd and 3rd, it's not mentioned. In the 3rd, Moses uses it, but in the last one, only his hand is referenced. So you've got to kind of read the details here. But if you take a deeper look, the waters of the Nile, life for the Egyptians. They were turned to blood, the symbol of death. In the final plague, there is blood that's applied, if you recall, to the doorposts, and every Hebrew is required to apply the blood, all right? The 2nd plague, the frogs, nocturnal in nature, and that brought with it darkness. While the 9th plague was actual darkness. They're almost attached in some weird way to a precursor and then a full-orbed event. The 3rd plague, the magicians exclaim, this is the finger of God, right? That would be in 8:19. And the 8th plague, Pharaoh says, I have sinned against the Lord your God. So if you start picking these plagues apart and lining them up, you see some interesting things. In the 4th plague, the Lord said, no swarms of flies shall be in the land of Goshen, in which my people dwell. And there is a connection to the 7th plague where it says, only in the land of Goshen, where the children of Israel there was no hail. So I want you to think, this is something very important. God had a way of protecting those that he wanted to protect and shield them from things that he didn't shield others from. So I'm just going to insert something right here, because in this congregation, yes, this congregation, there's a great debate. I get letters from a lot of you talking about rapture or no rapture. Is there a rapture? Is there no rapture? Just put this one in your pipe and smoke on it for a while. Because while God is pouring out wrath on the picture of Egypt, which is sin, the flesh, the world, the people that he basically chose to deliver, he also chose to spare from those plagues. Okay, we're going to leave that one alone. We'll come back to it at some point, because some of you who are kind of going in this direction would say, well, okay, I never thought of that before. But all right. In the 5th and 6th plagues, the cattle were attacked. That would be 9:3 and 9:9. And it seems clear to me that that represented something deeper. When we read about the children of Israel desiring to make and worship a golden calf. Now, remember I said to you, what did they worship in Egypt? This is not proof. There's more proof elsewhere outside of the book of Exodus. But I want you to think about this. You know, we've talked about this ad nauseum. They were so impatient for Moses to come down the mountain. They could have made anything, but they chose to make a golden calf. And I really want you to think long and hard, where did that idea come from? Being in Egypt. And it had to be something that they were previously worshiping there. Listen, you can play the whole, oh, no way. But, you know, I don't think you just pull out whole cloth. You've now been delivered. And the first thing you can think of is a cow. I don't know. Okay. If we analyze the first 3 plagues, lack of clean water to drink and water to water your livestock or to wash oneself is kind of pivotal right there. Their homes were invaded by frogs and lice, attacking them and their livestock. These plagues are beyond simple discomfort, with undrinkable water, unusable, undrinkable water, slimy invaders, and lice making their day-to-day life really miserable. So you might think, well, why? Like, why would you do that? Why would God do that? And you start kind of piecing these things together. The second group of plagues, the flies corrupted the land, destroyed their cattle, and the third, the boils covered their persons. The final 3 are like a scourge. The final 3 are like God saying, okay, here it comes, right? The hail destroyed their crops and cattle. The locusts consumed what may have remained of the crops. And then darkness covered the land, making it impossible. If you think about it, you can live without daylight, but it makes it almost impossible to grow food. And there's a plethora of things that happen without sunlight. So just think on these things. If we connect what Egypt means symbolically in the scriptures, sin, flesh, corruption, the world structure, then God sending these plagues was an answer to that. The water turned to blood says death, not life. The frog in Egypt was a fertility symbol. See, you start connecting the dots. Rebirth and new life. The god Heget, a deity depicted with a human-like body but with the head of a frog, was believed to assist in the final stages of labor and childbirth. So imagine you're now seeing this frog invade everywhere. Is this a statement saying prosperity and fertility, or is this kind of an omen saying this is the end? And you have to kind of tie those dots together. Some people have made assumptions that this was kind of like putting it in their face. No, this was God saying basically the end of everything. You take away water. You can't live without water more than 3 days. Maybe you might make it a 4th day. I don't think so. 3 days is about it. So you kind of get the picture here. The plague of frogs didn't represent life, like the Nile being turned to blood. The frogs represented a curse and the end of the fertility in that land. And you almost have to attach this to what will be the death of the firstborn for it to all make sense. Everything was rooted culturally in the firstborn. The lice represents filth and uncleanness. The world still yet in their sins, the matters of the flesh, the swarms of flies are not only a nuisance, but they are spreading disease and dung and everything else that you can think of. Cows were also a symbol of fertility. It's like God saying all of the bounty that made you thrive is going to basically crumble and disappear. And so we have this picture of the cow, symbol of motherhood, nourishment, associated with the goddess Hathor, who represented sustenance, love, joy, and the beauty of life. So if you start kind of putting this in the negative. Cows were also linked with Isis, as she had a more protective role over the god Horus, and they were symbolic of divine power in the afterlife. So these plagues are definitely all rooted in shaking up and dissolving the life of the people, all right? So we can also see that there is somewhat of we'll call it a moral significance to this. So it's almost like God was saying the splendor, the wealth, the beauty, the riches, the life, the fertility, all of that, and your gods are going away. And if you really think about it, someone who studies Egyptian culture and life, you have to ask yourself, what happened to this incredible dynastic ruling people that basically, by the time you get to the Roman period and the Ptolemies, everything is on its way down. You can start seeing, you see it in everything. You see it in the burial chambers, and you see it in the artwork. A lot of that artwork that's toward the Ptolemaic period, which is kind of the end of the Egyptian dynastic rule, looks sloppy and ugly, and things are just kind of going really bad for these people. The hail was a judgment upon the earth, focused on their disobedience. The locust eating everything is likened to the world, consuming the provisions of God without care. The darkness is usually a symbol of alienation or separation from God. So God was covering it all. In the death of the firstborn, a warning to those who reject being born from above. The second death is upon those whose hearts have been hardened towards God or the things of God. So kind of interesting here. If the plagues poured out on Egypt and its inhabitants had meaning for the Egyptians, they had meaning for the Hebrews as well. For them, for the Hebrews, it was a way for God, and hear me out, and don't go, oh, I can't believe you're saying this. It was a way for God to make himself known. And when I say that, I'm going to explain. See, God made himself known to Abraham and had exchanges with him. God made himself known to Isaac and to Jacob. But we don't read of more than that, basically having long discourses or a theophany or Christophany appearing to them. So we tend to think that if God spoke to Abraham and Sarah, and God spoke to Isaac, and God spoke to Jacob, he must have spoken to everybody, but he didn't. So this is why when Moses goes to the burning bush and God introduces himself to Moses, who should I say sent me? Moses didn't even know who this was. He says, you say, I am that I am sent you. And that's the first time that we have a name attached to God, that God himself discloses a name that we should call him by. So it tells me that Moses was not familiar. There may have been some vestigial remnant from his parents, some stories, some lore. But when he says, who should I say sent me? If he knew that the name of the Lord was the Lord, he would have said, well, of course, Lord, I know that you're sending me. But God had to tell him how to disclose who is dispatching you. That tells me that God was not known to many in that way and in that respect. So it's like saying these plagues, for the Hebrews witnessing this, was God's way of introducing a higher power. If they were worshiping gods in Egypt, this was a way of saying, this must be the God of all gods, without them knowing him yet. And you might say, are you sure about this? Well, I'm going to ask you a question. If you've ever looked into the remnants that we find that basically are the remnants of, we'll call them the people living in Goshen, perhaps the Hyksos, if you want to reference them like that. And there are a lot of things that remain there, including, I've talked about this, a statue which we know is the likeness of Joseph with his many-colored coat and his red mushroom hair. But there is no symbolism there that explains the worship of God or the name of God. There is nothing there that could even identify who these people were, which is why it remains a mystery, and people are very polarized over the subject of these Hyksos people. Who did they worship? Who did they follow? Now, when I say to you that the bulk of the people that were in Egypt did not know who this God was, it will become clear. I have other scripture to quote that reveals to you that they could not have been worshiping this God in Egypt. They may have known about him as a God among many other gods, but the plagues poured out were a way of saying, I am the God above everything. So this is kind of like, what a way to make a grand entrance, right? What a way to introduce yourself. But I will say this, I do find it hard to believe, this is the other side of my brain, this is I find it hard to believe that somewhere from the time that God spoke to Abraham and uttered these promises, I find it hard to believe that somebody somewhere wasn't repeating and perpetuating what God had said, so that somewhere there might have been a little pocket knowing that conversation that God had with some entity, whether they called him the Lord or they called him God or gods, I don't know. had to have been perpetuated by word of mouth to a small group of people. Could that have been the children of Israel living in Goshen before bondage? Possibly. I'd say even very likely. But what happens after several generations of no one perpetuating the story, or any? It would get corrupted, it would probably get caricatured, and that's why I said to you, take the time to look into this. So when people are busy arguing about who these people were, God said, yes, your seed's going to end up in bondage. And he also says they're going to come out with greater substance. When they do come out, they're going to come out with great substance. I don't know how you go from being a slave to great substance, but the book reveals it very, very plainly. So let's keep going here. As for the people who lived in the land replete with every type of god and idol, the God of Abraham, or the living God, as I said, would not have really been that well known. And if you keep going back to this, you're going to see that the people begin to see this display, this horrific, it must have been terrifying display of power as some great entity. And if they said this is God or this is the gods, it doesn't matter. They had to see, they had to know. Now, in each plague, we have judgment of some type based on a false god or false worship, from cows, flies, and frogs, which were all venerated in Egypt. Most of you know that I am big into all things Egypt, so you can find scarabs of beetles. They were big into that, flies, cats, birds, but then they all had a duality. So you could have a beetle that could be in the form of a scarab with something of a message, some type of hieroglyphics, and at the same time, the symbol itself was related to one of their gods, and what that god did, whether it was the god of fertility or whatever, as I've already said. So why does all this matter? Because we know that the one who disguises himself as an angel of light is always an imposter. So when you look at the worship system in Egypt, and you might say, but that was their culture, but it all becomes clear that these people they had a false system. It was all based on animal beings merged with people beings and ideas of how the afterlife actually works. I'm sure many of you know, you've probably visited the exposition of King Tut, and within that they tell it's a good way of telling the story and making something understood. For example, that Tut was buried with thousands of little Shabti dolls, because those little you've seen those little dolls or little figurines. Some of them are very precise and some of them are very ugly looking, but they look just like a sarcophagus of a mummy. And they would be buried with that because in the afterlife, those would come to life and be the servants for King Tut. Okay, all right, so I'm going to ask for some miniature something to be put in my grave with me. I don't know, I think it'll just be like, oh, why did she get buried with that? Because she believed that these things would help her get over there. I don't know, doesn't make sense to me, but whatever. All right, when we look at Pharaoh, he would not be outperformed. His desire was to reduce the power down to a cheap trick, just like the magicians. And we know how that works out. So basically, that exchange between Pharaoh's magicians and Moses and Aaron was to put God's power on display as irrefutable. The plagues of Egypt are also a future snapshot of what God will ultimately do when he pours out his wrath in the book of Revelation. In the book of Revelation, you have a passage that talks about 2 witnesses, and he'll send the 2 witnesses to perform miracles before their enemies. Revelation 11, verses 3 through 6. Here we have 2 witnesses, Moses and Aaron, standing in front of the enemies of these people, which are their oppressors. There's a lot of parallels, right? The enemies of these 2 witnesses will also perform miracles, just like the magicians of Egypt's past. So you're going to have very similar things play out. They're just, if you read them, you'll see the connections. God will execute judgment and wrath upon the world as he did in Egypt, but he will also protect his people. And you've got to read these passages, 7:4, 12:6, and 14 through 16, very much alluding to what God did to the people in Goshen. You read that, you make your own mind up. I'm not getting involved in that conversation today. The water, again, will once more be turned to blood, Revelation 8:8 and 16, verses 4 through 5, as well as the appearance of frog-like creatures, as well as locusts. So you've got almost a repetition. You'll have boils in the book of Revelation, hail, and darkness shall fall upon the earth. Read Revelation 16:10 and Isaiah 60. So you get the idea that God is saying, this is why I said you've got to read the Old Testament carefully. For those people who say, oh, well, the Old Testament's for those people. No, it's for us. It is a prototype of what God is going to do at the end, except it's going to be way worse. But ultimately, if you're reading the book of Revelation, God is going to be pouring out vials of wrath upon the earth. And you've got we'll call it a very similar scenario where these people basically, look at history. Are there Egyptian people living today? Yes, but I'm talking about the dynastic period. How did it just completely go away? You've got to look at that history and investigate for yourself. You'll see that it's almost like God said, I'm done. And when God says he's done, he's finished. So just as we're looking at what happened in Exodus, death will consume the multitudes, just like the population in Egypt. We're not going to be talking about the firstborn, however, we're going to be talking about all who remain, who refuse to listen to either the 2 witnesses or the 144 preachers of righteousness. That's just a fact. Now, if we read Exodus carefully, we can really see from start to finish, there are prototypes in here. And it's kind of mind-boggling, because if you don't read this right, you read this and you isolate it. But if you look at it as a bigger picture, God foretold to Abram 4 generations in, they'll come out with great substance. We know they did. God has been warning us. The beauty is God has given us the warning. So now we're just stupid for not listening. Okay, God maybe didn't warn those people. They had no knowledge. We have knowledge, so we have no excuse. I also want you to think about an earlier exchange between Pharaoh and Moses when Pharaoh asks or says, who is the Lord? This is very interesting because there's another translation that reads, I do not know the Lord. And I think that's very interesting. That although everything was being revealed in front of him, he could say, I do not know. Who is the Lord? I do not know the Lord. Kind of an interesting utterance, if you will. But Moses was sent to tell Pharaoh that God was sending a plague or plagues, so, and I quote, that you will know that I am the Lord. And if you think that that's not going to be the same picture played out at the end, you're very mistaken. God's going to do all this to sort the people out who are here on the earth, and those that can look to him and look upon him or hear the message and still in the last hour be saved, who will know the Lord. So there's all of this kind of, we'll say, it's a warning if it's read right, to understand that God is serious and God is not going to let the world in its sinfulness just go unpunished. Pharaoh was told, of course, as I just said, the purpose of the plagues or the frogs was that, quote, that you may know that there is no God like our God. In regard to the hail, that you may know that there is none like me in the earth. The plague of hail was basically the point of no turning back, because after the plague of hail, it's like, okay, God says, I have warmed everybody up. Here's the final act, and it's just going to get really bad from there on in. So, at this time I will send my plagues upon thine heart, and upon thine service, and upon thine people, that they may know us that there is no one like me in all the earth. What else is introduced in that statement? The idea that God is Lord over all the earth. It's the first time that's introduced in that utterance. Think about it, that there is no one like me in all the earth. If you read in Hebrew, there's a slight nuance there, but still, I'm going to leave it like that for right now. So, what can be gleaned, or what could the people glean from what was being said? First, that the people began by not knowing much about God, and you can discern that very clearly, that he revealed himself by the hand of a deliverer. So I'm going to ask you a question. Moses was just a man. Just a man, not God, but a prototype. And in Deuteronomy, you read that basically there is a prophecy and they're saying, greater than you, Moses, pointing to Christ. But everybody reads right over that because, God forbid, we should actually interpret that. So the goal would have been to get people to trust and believe and obey God. All the truth was laid out before them, and still it wouldn't be enough to create a heart filled with gratitude for deliverance. So eventually the people would turn on Moses and his God. You know the whole story of what they do in the desert. And unfortunately, we get to relive these passages in our reality with every generation that passes. And why do I say that? Because it's like you read this and you read about everything they saw and about the great deliverance and about the miraculous deliverance of how they even exited Egypt. And still, what's the first thing they do when they have this newfound freedom? They worship a golden calf. They take the substance that God had said, take from the Egyptians, which we know would be needed. God doesn't have to tell these people what it's for. They probably thought, I'm rich. But that substance was for something God planned to do in the desert called the tabernacle in the wilderness, which required fine silver and gold and materials, right? Where would they get this if they were in bondage and they didn't have anything, right? So it's like God was saying, I have something in mind, but I'm not going to tell you. And the first thing they do is take that provisions that God had given them to apply to God's program, and they apply it for something in false worship for themselves. And that really tells you everything that you need to know about humanity. I could just stop right here and say, good day, folks, that's my message. Because that is what most of humanity is like. They've either heard or they've read or they've been exposed, and they still choose to reject, to disobey, to kind of push it to the side. And for some, they get real creative and say, this is mere myth, it's mythological or fabrication, never happened. Okay, suit yourself. I'm not going to argue that. We do have, when people say, you can't prove any of this happened. Oh yeah, actually we can. In the secular, not even from the Bible. There is enough secular proof, enough secular evidence. And this is what I love. God left the monuments in the sand as a testimony to say, yes, these people actually existed. This isn't a fabrication or a fantasy. Make no mistake about it, though, when people talk about the idea of what God was doing, it was not to be cruel. It was to reveal himself. That must be made clear. Now, as God turned the Nile to blood, God will give a warning at the beginning of the tribulation, the great tribulation, when the moon becomes blood. Think again back to the waters of the Nile, which represented life. And we have water references in the New Testament that represent life, equated in John's writing. And the water basically turned to blood, a demonstration of God's power. Flip that. What's the first miracle that Jesus does? He turns the water to wine. You get these parallels, and you have to tell yourself at some point, because I get this all the time, the God of the Old Testament, it's the same person, just taking up a tent of human flesh and something we could identify with that looked like us. That's all. Same God through and through. And if you're really paying attention, you're going to start looking at much of what's in here and seeing that, we can look and analyze, and we've analyzed the tabernacle, and we could see that everything points to Christ. A lot of what's in here points to the book of Revelation and how God will handle the sinfulness of the world at that time when he chooses to start unleashing the beast, when I call it the vials of wrath. So it's just something we have to kind of put in there, all right? There was an interval of 7 days between the first and the second plagues. Like the living God set a set time, 7, the number of completion or perfection if you want. So also of divine order. 3 days of darkness covered the earth, 3 hours of darkness while Christ was on the cross. You begin to see God is not doing anything that new. You've got to look into what it means, the deeper meaning beneath all of that. We know that the darkness, for example, when Christ was hanging on the cross was like saying the separation that Christ endured while all the sins were placed on him, that created that gap that basically made it become dark. If you want to say it that way, separation from God. Here we have God basically back in this book saying, I am separating you from me completely. We're in every dimension of all of these plagues. So we can see that, forgive me for saying it like this, but everything points to something else in this book. And too many people read this and act as though the focus should be strictly on what happened to these people in that moment, when in fact it's showing us a bigger picture. Now, there is more to say on the plague of darkness and the plague of the firstborn, because those become really important and definitely connect us to the New Testament in ways that are impossible for me to get into right now. But what I want to say to you is what I find interesting. If you just simply read this and you start where I started, there are several things that you can take away. One, you can completely dispel the idea that the people who were in Egypt's bondage were practicing any form of anything other than some form of idolatry that they gleaned from their environment, okay? And there may have been a scant couple of people that were perpetuating some old man there in antiquity that had told them about some promise about a couple of things. I'm sure that was being uttered somewhere, but it wasn't the vast majority of people. And I want you to think long and hard the fact that take a person like Joseph, who from a young age, we'll say maybe he was sold away into that band of marauders that sold him into Egypt's bondage. Say he was a young man, a teenager, a young man, and hadn't necessarily had a lot of imbuement of God or the Lord, but knew who God was. When he died, he may have imparted something to his children, Ephraim and Manasseh, those half Egyptian, half, we'll call them children of Israel. But in the bigger picture, it would be very hard for me to say, oh, they knew all about the living God. Only Jacob was still talking and spreading that word to his children directly and blessed them in that. Look at the final chapters of Genesis, where he's blessing Jacob, who becomes Israel, is blessing his children, which includes the half-born Egyptian children of Joseph, Ephraim, and Manasseh. They directly may have heard Jacob attribute blessings to God or to the living God or to the Lord. But I guarantee you, it probably, as time went on, got less and less. So those children may have spoken the word about God or uttered something about that, but as time goes on and they're having children and those children are having children, it becomes broken telephone. So please do not tell me that they went into Egypt's bondage practicing any form of anything that we can define today as a structured religion. They were not. That's one. Two, this is a book designed, if we're reading it right, to tell us a lot about us and where we're at right now. Abundant warning for those people who actually hear the word of God and don't care to take heed because they treat it like, you know what, this whole God thing, I've got people around me, I don't believe anything in God's word. It's all a lie. It's all to make money. It's all to capitalize on people's fear. Everything is an excuse. But how about this? What if I'm right and that mindset is wrong? What if God is now still calling people to save them and letting us know in advance, we have the warning, because we're reading the book of Exodus and we can read the book of Revelation, that God will once more pour out his wrath upon the earth. And if you think, well, I won't be here for that, okay, think whatever you want. Now, I've got people that say to me, well, do you really believe this? You know what? I do. And not because emotionally I believed. I've been digging in this book. I told you, I started my journey as a naysayer, wanting to find fault and disprove. And at some point, I always believed God, but a lot of the stuff in the Bible is like, really? And when you start studying it, you realize something. God is still saying the same message, and even more profound, because he's saying, pay attention. The land of Goshen for those people while they were on the earth and all the stuff's hitting the fan, he says, those people in Goshen will not suffer. And for those people who didn't know God, they're told, take that lamb, slay it, apply the blood to the doorpost and the lintel. Just that act, you may not know who I am, but just that act would be enough to save and to spare you and your household. Now, somebody might say, well, you know, there's no record anywhere of this event ever happened, because these are the debates that happen among secular and religious scholars. It never happened because you can't prove it happened, and here we go on this big circle of it didn't happen because it couldn't happen. But I got to tell you something. If you are even just looking at the secular and you're not interested in this book, I would like for you to explain to me the extinction of the Egypt that we once knew. All that remains of that Egypt are the unearthed sarcophagi, are the tombs, are the pyramids. That's what remains. Those are the monuments in the sand that give an attestation that these people actually exist. And can you imagine if we didn't have any of that, they'd say it never happened at all. If you are inclined to look, you will find proof in the secular, not here, that these events happened. I'm going to keep going on this. I have a lot to say, so we'll keep going next week. But what I want to leave you with is there's purpose and reason for studying the Old Testament. It's not just simply a book that belongs to somebody else. If you call yourself a Christian, it is your duty to understand the shadows and the types and their fulfillments. And this plays out just as that, as you will see next week when we talk about the darkness that covered the land and the death of the firstborn, which I hope then ties everything together and makes it clear. God is not cruel. God gave these people, even the Egyptians, he gave them an opportunity to be saved. Just want you to think about this. You know what that Passover actually represents? It doesn't represent some special people who were selected out and they're special. It represents the difference between people who hear instructions from God and obey them and carry them out versus those that don't. And the consequences are right there. Those that lived and those that did not. Those who will go on to live forever with him and those that will go on to live forever without him. The consequences are laid out there as plain as day if you care to look. This isn't a book just for a set group of people with a set religion. This book, this whole entire book, Old and New, combed, represents what God has designed perfectly in his infinite wisdom. And the end of this book, which we know how it all ends in the book of Revelation, says, I will once more do this, but it will be the end. And it will not be the end of a dynastic, dynamic kingdom. It will be the end of disobedience of mankind on the earth. That's enough warning. But you know what? If you don't take it seriously, you can just lie to yourself and make it like, well, you know what? I'll do it later. It's not my problem. I'm a good person. I don't have to worry about that. We shall see. And that's my message. You've been watching me, Pastor Melissa Scott, live from Glendale, California at Faith Center. If you would like to attend the service with us Sunday morning at 11 a.m., simply call 1-800-338-3030 to receive your pass. If you'd like more teaching and you'd like to go straight to our website, the address is www.pastormelissascott.com.